Many similarities exist between education research and social work research. Some examples of similar micromethods used in teaching and social work might include reflective listening, having empathy, evaluating progress, group facilitation, and sharing ideas through self-disclosure for the purpose of learning something important or life-changing. Similar macro methods used in teaching and social work might include avoiding authoritarian behavior, cultural competency, using self-determination theory and perspective, having an optimistic attitude or a strengths perspective, and valuing evidence-based practice. The acquisition of knowledge can be either temporary or longer lasting. According to the cognitive theory's description of learning, learning occurs when new information is applied to old information, which is then stored into our organized cognitive systems of thinking. Motivation in learning research focuses on how to transfer knowledge into something more lasting and not a fill up and dump out method. Fill up and dump out would be similar to cramming for an exam and then forgetting everything that was learned in just a few days. Increasing student motivation helps make learning more lasting for students. There are certain things that the research tells us about how to increase motivation in learning. The meaningfulness of the material is important. It needs to be relevant to our lives, and we need to know how to apply it in meaningful ways. Our relationship with others motivates us. Our relationship with students and professors help motivate us for learning. How we communicate can be motivating. How do we communicate clearly and make the information understandable? Do we communicate respectfully? Are we friendly and accessible? Do we smile at students and do we know their names? And do we allow students to actively engage with the material, such as through discussions? We also know it's very important that students feel a sense of self-efficacy or confidence when learning. Positive reinforcement increases confidence. Active engagement with the material also builds confidence. And being challenged builds confidence. Students also need to have some self-determination in their learning. A lot of motivation research points to the importance of self-determination to increase motivation. In different ways, social work bridges well with research on motivation and learning. Social work research values self-efficacy to increase motivation and learning. Self-efficacy is no doubt supported in the broader educational research. However, other common areas of motivation and learning research would partner well with social work research. Two theories come to mind when considering social work education: social cognitive theory and achievement goal orientation theory. Social cognitive theory is important because it is a broad theory that takes into consideration human behaviors, the social environment, and personal traits. Social cognitive theory encompasses sub-theories such as self-efficacy theory or modeling theory. Achievement goal orientation theory research helps us understand that how a person learns will ultimately affect their motivation in learning. Learners typically have either a learning orientation or performance orientation. Learning orientation means that a person is more focused on learning than the grade outcome, while performance orientation means the opposite, that the person is more concerned with their grade. Performance-oriented people tend to compare themselves to other students, which is referred to as normative comparison. Both the learning and performance orientation are beneficial for motivation and learning under the right circumstances. What sets the two apart, however, is that a performance orientation is more fragile. If a student fails, feels that their confidence is wavering, or perhaps starts out at a lower confidence level, their motivation and learning will be negatively impacted. A performance-oriented person, under the right conditions of high confidence, will often outperform a learning-oriented person. However, few people are at a high confidence state all the time. People are a bit fragile at times. Over time, learning-oriented people will outperform a performance-oriented person. Achievement goal orientation concepts can also be applied to teachers and educational systems, which reinforce either a learning or performance orientation. Why is understanding the learning or performance orientation important for teaching social work students? Social workers value research on self-efficacy for increasing motivation and learning. The performance-oriented student is dependent on their own sense of self-efficacy in order to achieve. Furthermore, many systems support performance orientation whether we like it or not. Therefore, increasing a sense of self-efficacy is important as a protective factor to buffer against systems that are heavily grade-oriented or use normative comparison. How we communicate with students influences motivation and learning a great deal. One measurable variable that improves motivation and learning is how well teachers collaborate with students. Friendly collaboration has been shown to improve student motivation for learning. It improves critical thinking, too. Take a study by a French group of researchers. They divided people into different groups to measure different levels of learning and performance orientation. They also planted extra participants who pretended to be people who were either disagreeable or agreeable. In group settings, the highest learners were from the learning orientation group where there was disagreement. The lowest learners were from the performance orientation group where there was also disagreement. The agreement groups were in the middle. Learning orientation in a collaborative setting where diversity of thought matters is important for critical thinking. Without these two variables, learning orientation plus disagreement, there is a risk of two situations occurring: groupthink or the spiral of silence. Groupthink occurs when everyone yields to a group opinion just for the sake of maintaining the group. The spiral of silence occurs when people are afraid of expressing a different opinion because they're afraid of being different, thus creating an even greater misperception of what the majority of people actually think. In a sense, these two variables, learning orientation plus disagreement, emphasizes group flexibility, the ability to listen to others, the ability to consider different perspectives, and to be comfortable with conflicting opinions, all of which are important for increasing critical thinking and communication skills. This dynamic also improves job performance. Multiple studies have shown that collaboration and teamwork improves job performance and social services outcomes. Another aspect of a collaborative environment that has been shown to improve student motivation and learning is a professor who is seen as caring. Caring is perceived when there is trust, closeness, and when the professor uses verbal signals such as asking for students' opinions, responding to emails, or calling students by their first names. Nonverbal signals also indicate caring, such as smiling, using eye contact, or moving towards a student who is talking. A professor who is perceived as caring is comforting to students and helps them feel good about themselves. They are empathic, understanding, and share control over the learning environment. Caring professors also have a tolerance for different opinions, which is important for critical thinking in a collaborative environment. A professor who is caring is a likable professor, and when students feel good about a professor and a class, they are more likely to be more motivated. Affective Perseverance Theory explains why it's so important that students like their professor and their course. According to this theory, people's strong feelings about people, things, or situations tend to persevere even after contradictory evidence proves otherwise. This is especially true when emotions are very difficult. The research shows that bad impressions are harder to recover from and change than good impressions. This is important because bad feelings can carry over not only within the length of the course, but also into future courses or, worse yet, with clients and families. Effective learning occurs when students like a professor in class in ways that are motivating for students. Current research shows strong correlations between effective learning and cognitive learning, which is testable knowledge. When a professor uses affinity-seeking behaviors, that is, getting the class to like them and their class, then students are more likely to have higher rates of effective learning, which in turn leads to higher rates of motivation and thus cognitive learning. Students are also more likely to remember the material and more likely to test better later on when they like a professor in class. Some of the best affinity-seeking behaviors a professor can use are using facial expressions and body language to indicate caring and interest, actively listening to students, being dynamic and interesting, eliciting students' thoughts, being optimistic about students and teaching, and helping students feel good about themselves. It's not enough to just be likable and interesting. A professor must also be able to convey material in ways that make sense for students. The material must be interesting and challenging, but also understandable and clear. The statement that it's not enough to be likable is really a mistake. Research shows that professors who challenge students but who are clear and understandable are also going to be more likable to students. Friendly but unclear professors get lower course evaluation scores, and students are less likely to feel motivated to learn. You may be asking, why does being clear during instruction increase student motivation and learning? Other than the obvious that students will learn more when they are less confused, Students are also less anxious and apprehensive to ask questions when the material is presented in clear ways. Student anxiety can be explained by uncertainty reduction theory. If a professor teaches in unclear ways, then students are more likely to avoid the professor. It only makes sense that a student might not approach a professor who they feel has already shown a communication style that is confusing to them. There are different reasons to explain why professors might not teach in clear ways. A professor maybe does not interact enough with students or does not assess if students are picking up the information and instead lectures on without a clue as to what's going on in the student's head. The professor might also have bad handouts with information that is not organized. A professor might overload students with information, and students might have a hard time understanding the main points. A professor might not have good teaching structure. Perhaps there's no headings or subheadings to introduce the material, or no clear transition statements from one topic to another. Additionally, a professor might not know some of the evidence-based teaching techniques, such as using organizational cues. Organizational cues are useful for providing clarity to the material. Organizational cues are verbal and written cues to help students organize knowledge. An example of organizational cues might include a professor repeating the main points during teaching or writing the outline for the class on the board so that students can visually follow along with the lesson plan, or perhaps having students fill in a grid to organize similar concepts. Emotional interest cues are messages that elicit an interest in the subject, such as highlighting relationships between interesting concepts, applying information to a popular song, or creating repetitive memes to discuss application of a concept, such as using funny animal pictures. So what does all this mean for the future of social work education? The emphasis needs to be on how to motivate students so that learning is lasting. Something as simple as evaluating how much students like a class is a window into how much students are learning in practical ways. We also know from modeling theory that how we treat students will carry over to how students will treat others. Students are always observing the professor to figure out how to act. But unfortunately, teachers might tend to focus too much on sharing their knowledge rather than applying teaching methods. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. Knowing a lot about a subject or having a lot of work experience will not be enough for students to actively learn. What is more important is how we communicate with students using evidence-based teaching methods so that students actually understand concepts and feel confident that they know how to apply it. It is beneficial for professors to use the same skills in class they would in the social work field, so as to not only improve student motivation, but to also model communication skills as well as build rapport with students in the same way that a social worker would with clients, families, or coworkers. If we want student motivation and learning to improve, then social work departments will hopefully encourage evidence-based teaching while at the same time encouraging evidence-based practice. If learning is an assimilation of prior knowledge with new knowledge, then social workers' prior knowledge about good communication know-how is a great place to start assimilating innovative teaching methods.